My husband Richard nearly dropped his champagne flute when his mistress Melissa sashayed into my birthday celebration, her hand proudly resting on her swollen belly. She beamed around the room, completely unaware that I, the wife he told her, was just a financial complication, controlled every penny of his family's $40 million trust fund. The look of sheer panic that washed over his face as our worlds violently collided was almost worth the humiliation of that moment. I smoothed down my designer dress and took a slow sip of champagne, savoring the irony. The woman he had promised a lavish future didn't know that the fortune he'd been spending on her belonged to a trust that I, as financial executor, had complete authority over. Her arrival at my carefully orchestrated birthday dinner wasn't just unexpected. It was the perfect dramatic opening to what would become the most extraordinary turning point of my life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The elegant private dining room at the Rosewood fell silent, as conversation died mid-sentence. My closest friends and family members froze, crystal glasses halfway to lips, eyes darting between Richard's ashen face, the glowing pregnant woman who had just cheerfully introduced herself as Melissa Richards' fiancée, and me, Eliza Bennett, the wife of 12 years who, according to Richard's stories, apparently no longer existed. I had suspected the affair for months. Mysterious late nights, weekend business trips, the sudden password protection on his phone. What I hadn't suspected was that he'd been promising her marriage, a family, and a life of luxury funded by money he didn't actually control. "Eliza," Richard finally choked out, his voice strangled and unfamiliar. There's been a misunderstanding." "I don't think there has," I replied, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions beneath my composed exterior. "Melissa, was it? Why don't you join us? After all, any woman carrying my husband's child should certainly be at my birthday celebration." The photographer I'd hired captured the moment perfectly, Melissa's expression transforming from confident happiness to utter confusion, Richard's face draining of all color as he realized the catastrophic collision of his two carefully separated worlds and me, raising my glass in a sardonic toast to the spectacular implosion of my marriage. What no one in that room yet realized, least of all Richard, was that this moment would trigger a series of events that would reshape all of our lives. Because while Richard had been building his house of lies, I had been quietly preparing for exactly this scenario, gathering evidence, consulting attorneys, and most importantly, strengthening my position as trustee of the Bennett family fortune, a position his grandfather had ironically insisted upon when we married, claiming I was the only one with a head for business. As Melissa stood frozen in the doorway, her hand still protectively cradling her belly, I gestured to an empty chair at the table. "Please, sit down. I believe we have quite a lot to discuss." I know you're probably wondering how I maintained such composure in that moment instead of causing the scene everyone expected. Trust me, I'm still wondering that myself sometimes. The Rosewood hadn't been my first choice for my 40th birthday celebration. I'd initially wanted something more intimate, perhaps the lake house that had been in my family for generations. But Richard had insisted on this display of opulence, the city's most exclusive restaurant, a private dining room with views of the skyline, a 5-course tasting menu with wine pairings that cost more than some people's monthly rent. "You only turned 40 once," he'd said with that charming smile that had once made my heart race. "Let me spoil you." Now I understood it hadn't been about spoiling me at all. It had been about maintaining his carefully crafted image as the successful investment banker with the perfect life, an image that was critical to his positions on certain boards, his club memberships, his entire social standing in our exclusive circle, an image that was now shattering spectacularly before 22 witnesses. I should introduce myself properly. I'm Eliza Bennett, formerly Eliza Prescott of the Boston Prescotts. I met Richard during my final year at Wharton, where I was completing my MBA in financial management. He was 7 years older, already established, at his family's investment firm, Bennett and Sons, and possessed that particular blend of privilege, ambition, and charisma that seems cultivated in certain northeastern prep schools. Our courtship was a whirlwind of helicopter trips to Martha's Vineyard, weekend escapes to the Adirondacks, and intimate dinners at restaurants where the menus had no prices. 6 months later, he proposed on a private yacht off the coast of Nantucket, and I said yes, dazzled by not just the 4-carat diamond but by the future he promised, a partnership in every sense of the word. What I didn't fully understand then was that Richard's family wealth came with strings attached. Old money always does. The Bennett fortune, accumulated over generations of shrewd, sometimes questionable investments, was protected by a complex trust structure designed to preserve the capital for future generations. Richard's grandfather, Edmund Bennett, had been particularly concerned about his grandson's occasional financial impulsiveness, a polite euphemism for the gambling problem that had been carefully hidden from the public but had nearly cost him his position at the family firm before we met. When we married, Edmund insisted on a unique arrangement. While Richard would receive a generous income from the trust, I would serve as co-trustee alongside the family attorney, Jeffrey Walsh. It was unprecedented in the Bennett family history, and Richard had been furious, seeing it as a humiliating vote of no confidence. But Edmund had been immovable. "She's the only one with the financial sense to keep you from squandering everything we've built," he'd said during a tense family dinner shortly before our wedding. "If you want access to your full inheritance, you'll accept this arrangement." Richard had accepted it with poor grace, and over the years I'd come to understand my role was largely symbolic. Jeffrey handled most of the actual trust administration. Or so I thought, until Edmund's death 3 years ago changed everything. Jeffrey had called me to his office for a private meeting, without Richard. "Edmund amended the trust 6 months before his death," he explained, sliding a document across his imposing mahogany desk. "In the event of his passing, you would become the sole executor, with complete discretionary control over distributions." He was concerned about certain patterns he had observed in his grandson's behavior. I'd been stunned, both by the responsibility and by the implicit confirmation that my marriage was not what I had believed it to be. What had Edmund seen that I had been missing? The answer began revealing itself shortly afterward. Small discrepancies in our finances, unexplained withdrawals, credit card statements delivered electronically rather than by mail as they had been for years. Richard becoming increasingly secretive about his schedule, his phone always carefully placed face down. I hadn't confronted him immediately. Instead, I began my own quiet investigation, using the access my trustee position provided to follow. The money trail. What I discovered was devastating. Regular transfers to an account I didn't recognize, charges at hotels I'd never visited, jewelry purchases that had never found their way to me. Still, infidelity was one thing. Painful but not entirely surprising given the gradual cooling of our marriage. What I hadn't anticipated was that Richard had been systematically lying about the extent of his authority over the family fortune, positioning himself as the primary controller of the Bennett wealth to everyone in his orbit, including, apparently, his pregnant mistress. As I looked around at my birthday guests, now witnessing the implosion of my marriage in real time, I realized that Richard's deception went far deeper than an affair. He had constructed an elaborate fiction about his financial position, a fiction that was about to spectacularly unravel. The photographer captured another perfect moment. Melissa slowly lowering herself into the chair I'd indicated, uncertainty replacing her initial confidence as she registered the tension in the room. Richard remained frozen, champagne flute still, suspended midair, as the first cracks appeared in the carefully constructed facade he'd maintained for who knew how long. "Richard has told me so much about his work," Melissa said, breaking the awkward silence, her voice wavering slightly, as she glanced around at the stunned faces. About the family investment firm he runs. I couldn't help but smile. The family firm he runs. Another lie. While Richard held the title of Senior Vice President at Bennett & Sons, his role was largely ceremonial. After his third major investment, mistake, the board, which included me, though Richard had never bothered to attend enough meetings to notice, had quietly moved him to a position where he could do minimal damage. "Has he?" I replied, my voice steady. "How fascinating. Please, tell me more about what my husband has shared with you." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Melissa's perfectly manicured hand trembled slightly as she reached for the water glass in front of her. The diamond on her left ring finger caught the light, a 3-carat oval that looked strikingly similar to one I'd noticed missing from Richard's grandmother's collection last month. I'd assumed he'd had it appraised for insurance purposes. Another lie in the elaborate tapestry he'd been weaving. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand," she said, her confusion evident as her gaze darted between Richard and me. "Richard told me his wife—" She stopped abruptly, realizing the dangerous territory she was entering. "Please, continue," I encouraged, keeping my voice measured despite the acid churning in my stomach. "What exactly did Richard tell you about his wife?" The room remained painfully silent, my birthday guests witnessing the unfolding drama with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. My mother had half risen from her chair, clearly torn between rushing to my side and maintaining the polite decorum that had been drilled into her since childhood. My best friend Vanessa was less conflicted, her face a thundercloud of protective fury as she glared at Richard. Melissa swallowed hard. "He said you were separated, that you'd agreed to divorce but were delaying for tax purposes." Her voice grew smaller with each word as the reality of the situation dawned on her. "He said you had separate lives and that you—" She glanced at my left hand where my wedding ring still sat. "You were seeing someone else." A shocked murmur rippled through the gathering. Richard had clearly underestimated the embarrassment threshold of Boston's social elite. They might overlook discreet affairs conducted with appropriate distance and deniability, but this brazen collision of wife and pregnant mistress at a society event was beyond the pale. "How fascinating," I replied, the calm in my voice belying the storm raging inside me. "Especially considering we renewed our vows just last year on our 10th anniversary. A rather elaborate ceremony for a separated couple. Wouldn't you agree?" Richard finally seemed to find his voice, stepping forward with the smooth confidence that had served him so well in boardrooms and bedrooms alike. "Eliza, perhaps we should discuss this privately." "I think we're well beyond privacy, Richard." I turned my attention back to Melissa, who was now visibly distressed, one hand still protectively curved around her belly. Despite everything, I felt a flicker of sympathy for her. She was young, mid-20s at most, and clearly believed whatever fiction Richard had crafted. "How far along are you?" I asked, gesturing toward her belly. 7 months, she answered, automatically, then looked horrified at having responded so candidly. I did the mental calculation. 7 months ago, Richard and I had been in Bali, celebrating what he'd called a second honeymoon, after a particularly tense period in our marriage. He'd been attentive, romantic, seemingly recommitted to us, all while his pregnant mistress waited back home. "And the Bennett family trust has been generous, I presume?" I asked, watching Richard's face carefully. The flash of panic in his eyes confirmed what I'd already suspected. Melissa looked confused. "I don't understand." "The trust fund," I clarified. "Richard must have told you about it, since he's been using it to fund your relationship, the apartment in Beacon Hill, the weekend trips to Miami, the vintage Aston Martin he bought last month." Her eyes widened. "How did you—" "Because I'm the one who approves every distribution from that trust," I said simply. Every dollar Richard spends comes with my signature, including, apparently, the funds he's been using to create a life with you. The revelation landed like a grenade in the center of the room. Melissa turned to Richard, her expression a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. You told me you controlled the family money, that once we were married we'd have access to everything. He doesn't, and you won't, I replied before Richard could formulate a response. Richard receives a monthly stipend that I authorize. The Bennett Family Trust, all $40 million of it, remains under my exclusive control as executor, per his grandfather's explicit instructions. Richard's face had turned an alarming shade of purple. That's not entirely accurate, Eliza. The legal arrangement is more complex than you're suggesting. Is it? I raised an eyebrow, reaching for my handbag. I withdrew a slim portfolio and removed several documents, sliding them across the table toward Melissa. These are the trust documents, highlighted for clarity. You'll note in Section 4 that Richard's access to the principal is entirely contingent upon my approval as sole executor following Edmund Bennett's death 3 years ago. Melissa stared at the papers, then at Richard. You said your grandfather left everything to you, that the company, the properties, all of it was yours to manage. A bitter laugh escaped me before I could suppress it. The company hasn't allowed him to make significant decisions since he lost $11 million on a single ill-advised investment 5 years ago. He maintains his title and office purely as a courtesy to the Bennett name. The color drained from Melissa's face. The perfect future Richard had promised her, the life of luxury, the financial security for her and her child, was evaporating before her eyes. My mother finally rose fully from her seat and approached me, placing a steadying hand on my shoulder. Eliza, perhaps we should end the evening early. This situation requires privacy. I covered her hand with mine, drawing strength from her presence. You're right, Mom, though privacy seems a luxury that's been forfeited. I addressed the room at large. I apologize to you all for this unexpected drama. Please understand if I cut our celebration short. As my guests began gathering their belongings amid uncomfortable murmurs and averted gazes, I turned back to Melissa. I imagine you have questions that deserve honest answers, which I doubt Richard has provided. Here's my card. Call me tomorrow, and we can talk properly. Richard stepped forward, his composure fragmenting as he realized the extent of the damage unfolding. Eliza, you're making a scene. This isn't like you. No, Richard, this is exactly like me, I replied coldly. Methodical, thorough, and unwilling to be made a fool of. The difference is, you're finally seeing it directed at you instead of working in your favor. As the dining room emptied, leaving just Richard, Melissa, and me in a triangle of tension, the reality of the situation settled over us. 3 lives irrevocably altered, a web of lies unraveled, and a power dynamic shifted dramatically, all because Melissa had walked through the wrong door at the wrong time. How long have you known? Richard finally asked, his voice stripped of its usual confident polish. About the affair? Months. About the extent of your lies to Melissa? That's tonight's special revelation. I gathered my things, suddenly exhausted by the performance of composure I'd been maintaining. I've already moved your things to the guest house. You can stay there while we sort out the legal details. Melissa's eyes filled with tears. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know you were still together. He told me, I believe you, I interrupted gently. Richard has always been exceptionally convincing. It's what made him such an effective salesman before the board restricted his client contact. Richard's facade finally cracked completely. You've been watching me all this time? Tracking my movements, my spending? Of course I have, I replied. Edmund made me promise on his deathbed that I would protect the Bennett legacy, not from external threats, but from you. I've been fulfilling that promise. The revelation seemed to physically diminish him. The powerful, confident man who had controlled our marriage for 12 years suddenly appeared smaller, cornered. "What happens now?" Melissa asked, her voice small. I looked at her, really looked at her, seeing beyond the role of mistress to the young woman who had been manipulated and lied to, who was now carrying a child whose future suddenly seemed far less secure than she'd been led to believe. "Now," I said, "we all adjust to the truth. It's rarely as comfortable as the lies we tell ourselves, but it's the only solid ground to build upon." I gathered my coat and purse. "You two apparently have a lot to discuss. I'll leave you to it." As I walked out of the private dining room, leaving Richard and Melissa to confront their collapsing fantasy, I felt an unexpected lightness. The marriage I had fought so hard to preserve had been built on illusions. Richard's carefully crafted persona, my willful blindness to his flaws, our mutual performance of the perfect power couple. Its destruction, while painful, was also liberating. Outside, Vanessa waited by the valet stand, having dismissed her driver to ensure I wouldn't be alone. "My God, Eliza," she said, pulling me into a fierce hug. "I can't believe you handled that with such dignity. I wanted to throw my drink in his face." I laughed, a genuine sound that surprised me. "The night's still young. There's time for drink throwing. Yet." As we slid into her car, she glanced at me sideways. "You're remarkably calm for someone whose husband just got exposed for having a pregnant girlfriend." "I've had months to process the betrayal," I admitted. Tonight was just the public confirmation of what I already knew. Though I will say, the pregnancy was an unwelcome surprise. "What will you do about the trust?" she asked. "Richard seemed shocked that you knew the details." "He always assumed—" I signed whatever Jeffrey put in front of me without reading it. That I was merely a decorative signature while the men handled the actual business. I gazed out at the city lights as we drove toward Vanessa's downtown apartment. I couldn't face the emptiness of my home just yet. He forgot that before I was Mrs. Bennet, I was Eliza Prescott with an MBA from Wharton and a job offer from Goldman Sachs that I turned down to support his career. Vanessa shook her head. "Men like Richard always underestimate women like you. It's their fatal flaw." "And it will be his downfall," I agreed, a new resolve hardening within me. Edmund Bennett saw what I was blind to for years, that Richard is brilliant at creating the appearance of success while systematically destroying actual value. He made me executor to protect the family legacy from Richard's worst impulses. "And now?" Vanessa asked, pulling into her building's garage. "Now I fulfill that responsibility," I said firmly. "Not just to honor my promise to Edmund, but because there's a child involved, a Bennett heir, regardless of the circumstances of conception. I won't let Richard's recklessness destroy that child's future the way he's jeopardized everything else he's touched." As we rode the elevator to Vanessa's penthouse, I found myself mentally cataloging the steps I would need to take in the coming days. Meeting with Jeffrey to review the trust provisions regarding divorce, securing the family properties, limiting Richard's access to Bennett & Sons' operational information, and, most unexpectedly, determining how to ensure Melissa and her unborn child were treated fairly despite the painful circumstances. "You know what's ironic?" I said as Vanessa poured us each a generous glass of bourbon, my birthday celebration reimagined. "Richard always treated me like I was the lucky one in our marriage, the middle-class girl who married into Boston aristocracy. He never understood that the Bennett name opened doors, but it was my capabilities that kept them open." "To capabilities," Vanessa toasted, raising her glass. And to the look on Richard's face when he realized he'd been outplayed by the woman he underestimated. I clinked my glass against hers, allowing myself a smile. "To new beginnings," I added, "however unexpected their arrivals may be." Later, as I lay awake in Vanessa's guest room, I scrolled through the birthday photos the photographer had sent to my phone, images captured before Melissa's arrival showing a woman I barely recognized. Poised, polished, and completely unaware that her life was about to implode and reform into something entirely new. The final image in the series showed me walking out of the restaurant, shoulders back, head high, alone but unbowed. It wasn't the birthday celebration I had planned, but it had become something far more significant. The day I stopped being Richard, Bennett's carefully curated wife, and reclaimed my identity as Eliza, executor, strategist, and architect of my own future. Morning arrived with the sharp clarity that follows life-altering revelations. I awoke in Vanessa's guest room to 17 missed calls from Richard, 4 voicemails, and 38 text messages ranging from apologetic to accusatory. I ignored them all, focusing instead on the single text from an unknown number. "This is Melissa. Can we meet today? Alone." The directness surprised me. I'd expected her to run back to Richard, to choose the comforting lies over the harsh truth. That she hadn't spoke to a strength I hadn't anticipated. "I'll be at Cabot's Cafe on Newbury at 11, I texted back. Public enough to discourage drama, private enough for an honest conversation. Vanessa appeared in the doorway, already dressed. For her morning run, 2 steaming mugs of coffee in hand. "How are you feeling?" she asked, handing me one. "Strangely clear," I replied, taking a grateful sip. "Like I've finally put down a heavy weight I didn't realize I was carrying." She settled at the foot of the bed. "Your phone's been lighting. Up all night." "Richard?" "Mostly. Also Melissa. She wants to meet." Vanessa's eyebrows shot up. "Are you going to?" "Yes," I said, surprising myself with the certainty. She deserves the truth, all of it. And I need to understand exactly what Richard promised her. Is that wise, legally speaking? I considered this. Probably not. But this isn't just about the divorce or the trust anymore. There's a child involved. A child who, regardless of the circumstances, is a Bennett by blood. Vanessa studied me for a moment. "You always did have an inconvenient sense of responsibility. Just remember, you don't owe either of them anything." "I owe myself clarity," I countered. "And I owe Edmund's memory the protection of his legacy, which now includes an unborn grandchild he never knew about." After showering and borrowing a casual outfit from Vanessa, I couldn't face returning home just yet. I called Jeffrey Walsh, the Bennett family attorney who had served 3 generations of the family with discreet competence. "I've been expecting your call," he said when his secretary put me through. "News travels fast in certain circles." "Then you know I need to meet with you urgently." "I've cleared my afternoon. Come by at 2. He paused. "Eliza, I want you to know that while I represent the Bennett family interests as a whole, Edmund was explicit about my primary duty being to you as executor. Whatever course you choose to take, you have my full support." The reassurance settled something in me. "Thank you, Jeffrey. That means more than you know. I'll see you at 2. Cabot's Cafe was busy with the late morning crowd when I arrived. Professionals lingering over laptops, tourists consulting, guidebook students hunched over textbooks. I chose a table in the back corner that offered a view of the entrance and ordered a pot of Earl Grey, needing something stronger than coffee but not quite ready for the wine I was craving. Melissa arrived precisely at 11, her confident stride, belying the nervousness evident in her face. She'd changed from the fitted emerald dress of last night into simpler attire, maternity jeans, an oversized sweater, minimal makeup. Without the glamour, she looked younger, more vulnerable, and I felt a renewed surge of anger toward Richard for manipulating someone so clearly out of her depth in his world. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, lowering herself carefully into the chair across from me. "Would you like something to drink?" I offered, signaling the waiter. "The ginger tea here is excellent. I practically lived on it during my first trimester." She looked startled by this personal disclosure. "You have children?" A familiar pang shot through me. "No." I miscarried in my second trimester. We tried again for several years before the doctors confirmed I couldn't carry to term. I'm sorry, she said, and seemed genuinely to mean it. Richard never mentioned. I imagine there's quite a lot Richard never mentioned, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. That's why we're here, isn't it? To fill in the gaps in each other's understanding. The waiter arrived, and Melissa ordered the ginger tea. When he departed, she folded her hands on the table, composing herself. I need to know the truth, she began. All of it. I thought I was building a future with a man who... She trailed off, then squared her shoulders. Just tell me what I'm really dealing with here. I poured myself another cup of tea, considering where to begin. Richard and I met 13 years ago. I was finishing my MBA, and he was already working at Bennett & Sons. To hear him tell it, it was love at first sight. In retrospect, it was more likely calculated interest. I had the financial expertise his grandfather wanted in the family, and he needed to settle down after some indiscretions in his 20s. Melissa listened intently as I outlined our marriage, the early years of apparent harmony, the gradual shift as Richard's true character emerged, the controlling behaviors disguised as concern, the financial machinations I'd only fully understood after Edmund's death. 3 years ago, when Edmund died, the trust structure changed, I explained. I went from co-trustee to sole executor, with complete discretionary control over all distributions. Richard's monthly allowance, the maintenance of the properties, the operational financing of Bennett & Sons, all of it requires my approval. And he never told you about me? Melissa asked, her hand unconsciously moving to her belly. He told me he was working late, traveling for business, networking with clients, the usual excuses. I smiled thinly. But to answer your real question, no. I had no idea he was building a parallel life. I knew about the affair, not about the promises or the pregnancy. She flinched. I feel like such a fool. He told me you were separated, that you were only maintaining appearances while the divorce was finalized for tax reasons. He said once the baby was born, we'd make everything official. When did you meet? At a charity gala last year. I was working for the event planning company. She twisted the diamond ring on her finger. He was charming, attentive, and I thought he was essentially single. I nodded, another piece of the puzzle falling into place. The Gardner Museum benefit last April. He volunteered to attend in my place because I had the flu. He pursued me relentlessly after that. Flowers at work, surprise lunches, weekend trips. Her voice wavered. 3 months in, he told me he was in love with me. By Christmas, he was talking about our future together, about raising a family. When I got pregnant, it wasn't planned. But he seemed so happy. He gave me this ring, said it was a family heirloom. It was, I confirmed, his grandmother's engagement ring, a 7-carat oval diamond in an Art Deco setting. It disappeared from the safe at the Cape House in January. I assumed he'd sold it. Melissa looked down at the ring in horror. He said it had been left to him specifically for his true love. Richard has always been creative with the truth, I said, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice, especially when it serves his interests. The waiter returned with her tea, creating a momentary pause in our painful exchange. When he left, Melissa looked at me with newfound resolve. What happens now? She asked, echoing her question from the previous night, but this time with clearer intent. Legally, financially, with the baby. It was the question I'd been preparing for since I awoke. That depends on several factors, including what you want. Regardless of Richard's deception, the child you're carrying is legally a Bennett. Under the terms of the trust, legitimate heirs are entitled to certain provisions. Her eyes widened. I'm not looking for money. Perhaps not, but your child deserves security. I leaned forward. I have a meeting with Jeffrey Walsh, the family attorney, this afternoon. If you're amenable, I'd like to discuss establishing a separate trust for your child independent of any arrangements with Richard. Why would you do that? She asked, confusion evident. After what I've done to your marriage? You didn't do anything to my marriage, I corrected her. Richard did. You were deceived as much as I was, possibly more so. And while I can't speak for what our interactions will be like in the future, I can ensure that an innocent child doesn't suffer for their father's poor choices. Tears welled in her eyes. I don't understand. You should hate me. Hate requires energy I'd rather direct elsewhere, I replied simply. Besides, Edmund Bennett taught me that true responsibility means making decisions based on principles, not emotions. He protected the family legacy from Richard's impulsiveness. Now, it's my turn to do the same. Melissa wiped her eyes with a napkin. Richard called me last night after you left. He said not to trust you, that you were vindictive and would try to turn me against him, that you'd use the trust to punish us both. I wasn't surprised. And what did you say? That I needed to hear your side before I made any decisions. She straightened in her chair. He didn't like that. A reluctant respect bloomed within me. This young woman, betrayed and vulnerable, still had the strength to seek truth rather than comfort. May I ask you something personal? I said, finishing my tea. She nodded. Are you in love with him? Beyond the promises and the lifestyle, do you genuinely love Richard himself? Melissa considered this with surprising thoughtfulness. I thought I was, she finally said. But I'm realizing I was in love with who I believed him to be, not who he actually is. She touched her belly again. I wanted my child to have a father who was honest, faithful, and trustworthy. The man I met last night in that dining room isn't any of those things. The simple clarity of her assessment struck me. How long had I continued loving a man who no longer existed, if he ever had? How many years had I spent justifying, rationalizing, and diminishing my own worth to preserve the illusion of a marriage? Richard will make promises now, I warned her. Dramatic gestures, tearful apologies, elaborate explanations that make his behavior seem almost reasonable. It's what he does when cornered. I know, she said quietly. He's already started. Last night he said he'd kept us separate because he was trying to protect everyone's feelings until the right moment. That he was planning to tell you everything after the baby was born. I couldn't help but laugh, a short, sharp sound devoid of humor. Always the strategist, our Richard. I told him I needed time to think, she continued. He didn't take it well, said I was being emotional and irrational because of pregnancy hormones. The familiar phrase sent a chill through me. He used to say the same to me. Any legitimate concern or disagreement was dismissed as emotional or irrational. It's how he maintains control. A look of recognition crossed her face. He does that all the time. I thought he was being protective, but he was ensuring you doubted your own perceptions, I finished for her, making you dependent on his version of reality. We sat in silence for a moment, two women united by the shared experience of loving and being deceived by the same man. Finally, Melissa removed the diamond ring from her finger and placed it on the table between us. This belongs to your family, not to me. I stared at the glittering heirloom. Edmund had given it to his wife Dorothy on their 50th anniversary, replacing the more modest ring of their youth. It represented a lifetime of genuine partnership and trust, everything my marriage to Richard had failed to become. Keep it for now, I said, surprising myself. Not as an engagement ring, but as collateral. A reminder that regardless of what Richard may say or do in the coming days, there are concrete truths he cannot change. She hesitated, then nodded, slipping the ring into her purse rather than back onto her finger, a small but significant gesture of independence. I should go, she said, gathering her things. Thank you for, well, not being what I expected. Expectations can be dangerous things, I replied, signaling for the check, especially when they're crafted by others rather than formed through our own observations. As we parted outside the cafe, I felt a strange sense of connection to this woman who, in another reality, might have remained forever my anonymous replacement. Instead, she had inadvertently become an ally in understanding the true nature of the man we had both mistakenly loved. Walking toward Jeffrey's office through the familiar streets of Boston, I realized the meeting with Melissa marked a crucial turning point, not just in the unfolding drama of my collapsing marriage, but in my understanding of myself. For years, I had defined my worth through Richard's estimation, measuring my success by his approval. Now, facing the complete dismantling of that external validation, I was discovering a more authentic measure, my capacity to act with integrity, even when hurt beyond measure. Edmund Bennett had seen this in me when Richard hadn't. He had entrusted me with his legacy not because I was Richard's wife, but because I possessed qualities his grandson lacked, qualities I had suppressed and diminished to maintain marital harmony. As I approached the imposing granite building, housing Bennett and Walsh Legal Associates, I straightened my shoulders and lifted my chin. The woman who entered Jeffrey's office today would not be the accommodating Mrs. Bennett who had signed where instructed and asked few questions. Today, Eliza Prescott Bennett was fully stepping into the role Edmund had envisioned for her, guardian not just of the Bennett fortune, but of its future, including the unborn child who would carry the family name. The realization brought with it a sense of purpose that transcended my personal pain. Richard had betrayed me, but in doing so, he had inadvertently set me free from the constraints of a marriage that had slowly been extinguishing my true self. Now, that self was re-emerging, stronger, clearer, and more determined than ever before. I know what you're thinking right now. Why am I being so calm about all this? Why am I not throwing Richard's designer suits onto the front lawn and setting them on fire? Trust me, that thought crossed my mind more than once. But sometimes the most powerful response isn't the most dramatic one. If you're enjoying this story of betrayal, unexpected alliances, and reclaiming your power, make sure you hit subscribe. Tomorrow I'll share how I discovered Richard's most shocking deception yet, one that even his mistress didn't know about. And let me know in the comments what you would do if you were in my situation. Jeffrey Walsh's corner office at Bennett and Walsh Legal Associates offered a sweeping view of Boston Harbor, but the family attorney's attention was entirely focused on me as I recounted the events of the past 24 hours. So to summarize, he said when I finished, removing his reading glasses and pinching the bridge of his nose, Richard has been systematically misrepresenting his authority over the Bennett Trust, using funds you approved for legitimate expenses, to finance a parallel relationship, and has now impregnated a woman who believed he was essentially divorced and in control of the family fortune. That's an impressively concise summary, I agreed, accepting the glass of scotch he offered. At 2 in the afternoon it might have seemed inappropriate, but Jeffrey had known me long enough to understand when social conventions should be set aside. Edmund foresaw Richard's capacity for self-destruction, Jeffrey said, settling back into his leather chair. But I don't think even he anticipated this particular scenario. What are my options, Jeffrey, legally speaking? He tented his fingers, considering. As executor, your position is quite strong. The trust gives you broad, discretionary powers regarding distributions. You could, if you wished, reduce Richard's monthly allowance to the statutory minimum specified in the trust, $20,000 annually. I nearly choked on my scotch. $20,000? Richard spends more than that each month on clothes alone. Edmund believed in safety nets. Not golden parachutes, Jeffrey explained. The minimum ensures Richard would never be destitute, but it's designed to be uncomfortable enough to motivate better behavior. And Bennett and Sons? Richard's position is primarily ceremonial, as you know. The board, which includes you, has the authority to remove him for cause. The evidence of financial impropriety you've gathered would certainly qualify. I considered this, swirling the amber liquid in my glass. And Melissa's child? Jeffrey nodded approvingly, as if I'd asked exactly the right question. Assuming paternity is established, which I don't imagine Richard will contest given the public nature of their relationship, the child would be a legal Bennett heir. Under the trust terms, legitimate heirs are entitled to educational trusts and certain inheritance rights. I'd like to establish a separate trust for the child, I said decisively. Independent of Richard's provisions and protected from his financial mismanagement. Jeffrey made a note on his legal pad. A sensible precaution. I'll draft the paperwork. He hesitated, then added, Eliza, while I admire your consideration for the child, I must ask, are you certain you want to pursue this course? Many in your position might take a less magnanimous approach. I considered his question carefully. This isn't about magnanimity, Jeffrey. It's about honoring what Edmund entrusted to me. He made me executor because he believed I would protect the Bennett legacy according to its true values, not its public image. The ghost of a smile crossed Jeffrey's usually impassive face. He would be proud of how you're handling this. Not many would maintain such perspective in the face of personal betrayal. I'm not saying I don't want Richard to suffer, I admitted, finishing my scotch. But I want that suffering to come from natural consequences, not vindictive actions. His grandfather taught me that true power lies not in what you can destroy, but in what you choose to preserve. Our conversation shifted to practical matters, freezing certain accounts pending full financial review, documenting the misappropriation of funds, preparing for the inevitable media attention when Boston society caught wind of the full story, and drafting interim amendments to the trust disbursement procedures. What about divorce proceedings? Jeffrey asked as our meeting concluded. Not yet, I decided. I need more information before making that decision. Right now, Richard believes he can charm or manipulate his way back into control. That misconception gives me time to secure the Bennett assets and establish proper provisions for Melissa's child. Jeffrey nodded, escorting me to the door. A strategic approach. Edmund always said you had the mind of a chess player, seeing 3 moves ahead while others are focused on the immediate play. The comparison warmed me. Edmund Bennett had been more of a father to me than my own had ever been. His belief in my capabilities had often exceeded my own, and I was only now beginning to understand why. As I left the building, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from Bennett & Sons' main office. Charlotte Weber, the firm's long-serving executive assistant, sounded uncharacteristically flustered. Mrs. Bennett, I'm so sorry to bother you, but there's a situation developing here that requires your immediate attention. What kind of situation, Charlotte? Mr. Bennett arrived about an hour ago, clearly agitated. He's been removing files from the secure archive and has asked the finance department to prepare wire transfers for significant sums to offshore accounts. When Mr. Harriman questioned the transactions, Mr. Bennett claimed they were authorized by you as emergency contingency measures. A cold clarity settled over me. Richard wasn't just scrambling to manage the fallout of his exposed affair. He was attempting to secure funds beyond my reach. Charlotte, listen carefully. No transfers are to be processed without my direct in-person authorization. Call security and have them secure the archive room. I'm on my way. I texted Jeffrey as my Uber raced through afternoon traffic. Richard, attempting unauthorized transfers at B&S. Meeting you there. His response was immediate. On my way. Board members notified. The Bennett & Sons Investment Group headquarters occupied the top 8 floors of a glass tower in the financial district, its lobby dominated by an imposing portrait of Edmund Bennett. I'd always found it slightly intimidating. The stern, gaze of the family patriarch seemingly evaluating everyone who entered his domain. Today, however, I drew strength from that painted scrutiny. The security team, already alerted by Charlotte, met me at the executive elevator. "Mrs. Bennett," Mr. Walsh called ahead with instructions. "Mr. Bennett is currently in his office with the door locked. He's refused entry to security and has disconnected his office phone." "Has he managed to complete any transactions?" "No, ma'am. The system was locked down according to protocol as soon as unauthorized activity was detected." I nodded, relieved that the safeguards Edmund had insisted upon were functioning as designed. "I'll handle this personally." Richard's corner office occupied prime real estate on the 52nd floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city. The space had always struck me as excessively grand for someone who performed so little actual work, but Edmund had insisted on maintaining certain appearances. The executive floor was unusually quiet as I approached, staff having been discreetly cleared from the area. Outside Richard's closed door stood 2 security officers and Jeffrey, who had somehow arrived before me. "He's barricaded himself inside," Jeffrey explained in a low voice. "Apparently he attempted to wire $12 million to a Cayman Islands account before the system flagged the transaction and froze his access." "$12 million, I repeated, the enormity of the theft attempt sinking in. "That's not impulsive. Panic, that's premeditated." Jeffrey nodded grimly. "The finance team found evidence he's been preparing for this contingency for months, setting up accounts, establishing transfer protocols, gathering confidential client information." A strange calm settled over me. The Richard I thought I knew, selfish, and entitled but fundamentally tethered to certain principles, had never existed. The man behind that door was a stranger who had been planning his escape long before Melissa accidentally exposed his double life. "Is the board assembled?" I asked. "Emergency session, conference room A," Jeffrey confirmed. "All members present, or on secure video link." "Good. Let's deal with Richard first, then address the board." I approached the heavy mahogany door and knocked firmly. "Richard, it's Eliza. Open the door." Silence. "I know you're in there, and I know what you've been attempting to do. The accounts are frozen, the transfers canceled. There's nowhere to run." More silence, then finally, his voice, slurred slightly in a way that suggested he'd been drinking. "Come to gloat, Eliza? To watch the final act of your carefully orchestrated humiliation? I've come to offer you one chance to salvage something from this situation," I replied evenly. "Open the door, and we can discuss terms. Keep it locked. And I'll have security break it down before I instruct the board to contact the authorities about attempted embezzlement." A bitter laugh filtered through the door. "Always so reasonable, so controlled. Did you plan all this? Tracking my movements, monitoring my accounts, just waiting for the perfect moment to spring your trap?" "No, Richard. You did this to yourself. Every step, every decision, every lie. I simply observed and protected what was entrusted to me." The silence stretched for nearly a minute before I heard the lock disengage. I nodded to the security officers to remain outside and entered alone. Richard's normally immaculate office was in disarray, papers scattered across the desk, a half-empty bottle of bourbon perched precariously on a stack of financial reports, his suit jacket flung over a chair. Richard himself stood by the window, silhouetted against the late afternoon sun, looking suddenly older and diminished. $12 million, I said quietly, closing the door behind me. "Were you planning to disappear with Melissa, or was she just another person you were preparing to abandon?" He turned, and I was startled by his appearance. Tie loosened, shirt rumpled, the carefully maintained facade of the polished executive completely dissolved. "She wasn't supposed to show up last night," he said, as though that explained everything. "We had a plan. After the baby was born, I would handle the divorce quietly. The transfers were preparation for our fresh start." "A fresh start built on stolen client funds," I noted, maintaining my distance. "Did Melissa know about this plan?" He snorted dismissively. Melissa knows what I tell her to know. She's a beautiful distraction, not a partner in decision-making. The casual cruelty in his assessment confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. Melissa was as much a victim of his manipulations as I had been, perhaps more so given her youth and the child she carried. So you were planning to flee with the money, perhaps take Melissa and the baby if convenient, and leave behind the financial wreckage of Bennett and Sons. I moved to his desk, surveying the scattered documents, client account information, offshore, banking details, property listings in countries with minimal extradition agreements with the U.S. It wasn't theft, he insisted, a flash of the old Richard emerging in his indignant tone. Those are Bennett accounts, Bennett money, my birthright. Your birthright, I repeated, which your grandfather explicitly placed under my control because he foresaw exactly this type of behavior. I picked up a document detailing a property in Monaco, a lavish villa overlooking the Mediterranean. How long have you been planning this, Richard? Was it before or after you met Melissa? He looked away, unwilling or unable to meet my gaze. Edmund never trusted me. From the beginning, he treated me like I was incapable of managing what should have been mine by right. He gave you every opportunity to prove him wrong, I countered. Multiple positions at the firm, mentorship from the best in the industry, second and third chances after significant failures. What he didn't give you was unchecked power to destroy what took generations to build. Richard moved to the small bar in the corner of his office, reaching for a clean glass. I noted with detached interest how his hands trembled slightly as he poured another measure of bourbon. What happens now? He asked, echoing the question both Melissa and I had posed in the past 24 hours. I assume the board is assembled, ready to strip me of my position and complete my public humiliation. That depends on you, I said, taking a seat in one of the leather chairs facing his desk. There are two paths forward, Richard. Choose carefully, because this decision will determine not just your financial future, but your relationship with your child. His head snapped up. She told you about the baby. She told me everything, I confirmed, including the promises you made about the wealth and position that awaited her once you were free of your troublesome wife. He had the grace to look momentarily ashamed, but it passed quickly. What are these two paths you're so generously offering? The first is simple. You resign from Bennett and Sons effective immediately. Relinquish any claims to unauthorized access to the trust beyond your stipulated allowance, and commit to a structured visitation and support arrangement for your child. In return, the board will characterize your departure as a personal decision, the trust will maintain your current housing allowance, and no criminal charges will be filed regarding today's attempted transfers. He took a long swallow of bourbon. And the second path? You continue this self-destructive spiral. The board removes you for cause, publicly citing financial impropriety. The trust reduces your allowance to the statutory minimum. Criminal charges are filed for the attempted embezzlement, with all the attendant publicity and legal consequences. And any relationship with your child will be governed by court-mandated arrangements rather than family-negotiated agreements. Richard stared at me, searching for weakness or hesitation. Finding none, he sank into his chair, suddenly looking every day of his 45 years. You've thought of everything, he said finally, a note of grudging respect in his voice. The perfect trap. Not a trap, Richard. Natural consequences. There's a difference. I stood, smoothing down my borrowed outfit. I'll give you 10 minutes to decide. The board is waiting. As I turned to leave, he called after me. You know, my grandfather always said you were the best investment he ever made. I never understood what he meant until now. I paused at the door, looking back at the man I had once loved, now revealed as someone I had never truly known. I wasn't an investment, Richard. I was a person who deserved better than what you offered. So did Melissa. So does your child. Remember that when you make your choice. Stepping back into the hallway, I took a deep breath, steadying myself for the board meeting to come. Whatever Richard decided, a significant chapter of my life was ending. What remained to be written was entirely up to me, a blank page both terrifying and exhilarating in its possibilities. The Bennett & Sons boardroom fell silent as I entered, Jeffrey a half step behind me. 14 faces turned toward me, the complete board including 3 video feeds from members who couldn't attend in person. These were the stewards of a financial legacy spanning 4 generations, men and women who had known Richard his entire life and had worked alongside Edmund Bennett for decades. William Porter, the board chairman and Edmund's oldest friend, spoke first. "Eliza, thank you for joining us on such short notice. I understand we're facing an unprecedented situation." "That's putting it mildly, William," I replied, taking the seat at the head of the table, a position traditionally reserved for the Bennett family representative, but one Richard had rarely occupied, preferring to delegate board meetings to others he deemed better suited to the tedium. I surveyed the faces around the table, noting the varying degrees of concern, curiosity, and in some cases, barely concealed satisfaction. Not everyone on the board had appreciated Richard's entitled approach to his position. As you've been informed, Richard attempted to execute unauthorized transfers totaling approximately $12 million to offshore accounts this afternoon. I began, my voice steady. This appears to be part of a longer-term strategy to divert company and trust assets, potentially in preparation for leaving the country. Murmurs rippled around the table, but I continued. Thanks to the safeguards implemented by Edmund, the transfers were flagged and halted before completion. Richard is currently in his office considering the options I've presented to him. "What are those options?" asked Victoria Harrington, one of the newer board members who had frequently clashed with Richard over investment strategies. Option 1. Resignation, cooperation, and a dignified transition that protects both the company and the Bennett name. Option 2. Forced removal, criminal charges, and public exposure of his actions. William leaned forward. "And you believe he'll choose the first option?" "Richard values appearance above all else," I replied. "The prospect of public humiliation is a powerful motivator." As if on cue, the boardroom door opened and Richard entered. He had straightened his tie and put on his jacket, but the rumpled shirt and reddened eyes betrayed his emotional state. Still, he mustered his characteristic charm as he addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the unorthodox circumstances of this meeting." His voice was steady, his posture upright, a masterful performance that might have been convincing if I hadn't witnessed his breakdown minutes earlier. "After careful consideration of recent events," he continued, "I've decided it's appropriate for me to step back from my operational role at Bennett & Sons, effective immediately. My wife," he glanced at me, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face, "has kindly agreed to work with me on a transition plan that ensures the continued stability of the firm." The relief in the room was palpable. No messy public removal, no potential scandal to rattle client confidence. Richard had chosen the path of least resistance, as I'd known he would. William nodded gravely. "The board appreciates your decision. Richard, we'll work with Eliza to ensure a smooth transition." He turned to me, a question in his eyes. "I'll remain as the Bennett family representative on the board," I confirmed, "and will continue to oversee the trust's investment interests. Jeffrey will draft the necessary documentation to formalize these arrangements." Richard remained, standing, clearly expecting some acknowledgement of his gracious decision. When none came, he cleared his throat awkwardly. "If there's nothing else, I'll clear out my office." "Actually," I interjected, "security will pack and deliver your personal effects. Your access to the building has been suspended, effective immediately." For a moment, raw fury flashed across his face, the mask of civility slipping to reveal the anger beneath. But as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, replaced by a tight smile. "Of course. Sensible precaution." He nodded stiffly to the board. It's been a privilege serving with you all. No one responded. Richard's charm, which had smoothed over so many missteps throughout his career, had finally lost its effectiveness. He was, for perhaps the first time in his life, experiencing the consequences of his actions without a safety net. As the door closed behind him, the board erupted in overlapping questions. I raised a hand, calming the chaos. I know you have concerns. I'll address them all. But first, we need to focus on stabilizing client relationships and ensuring operational continuity. For the next 2 hours, we worked through the immediate issues: client communications, interim leadership, structure, financial reviews to determine if Richard's attempted embezzlement was an isolated incident or part of a pattern. Through it all, I found myself drawing on skills I had honed but rarely showcased during my marriage: analytical thinking, strategic planning, decisive leadership. As the meeting concluded, William approached me privately. "Edmund would be proud," he said quietly. "He always believed you were the real strength behind the Bennett name, though Richard never saw it." "Richard saw what he wanted to see," I replied. "In me, in the company, in his life. Reality was always optional for him." William's weathered face creased in a sympathetic smile. "What will you do now, about the marriage, I mean?" I considered the question carefully. "Process what's happened. Make arrangements for Richard's child. Ensure the company's stability isn't compromised." I met his gaze directly. "Divorce will come, but on my timeline, not his." He nodded approvingly. "You've earned the right to dictate those terms." The sun was setting as I finally left the Bennett & Sons building, casting long shadows across the financial district. My phone showed 8 missed calls from Richard, which I ignored, and 1 text from Melissa. "Can we talk again tomorrow? There's something else you should know." I stared at her message, wondering what further revelations awaited. How much more complicated could this situation become? Exhaustion suddenly overwhelmed me. The adrenaline that had carried me through, confrontations with Richard, meetings with Jeffrey, and the emergency board session was fading, leaving behind bone-deep weariness. For the first time, I directed my Uber driver to take me home rather than back to Vanessa's apartment. Whatever awaited me there, emptiness, memories, Richard's lingering presence, I needed to face it eventually. Tonight seemed as good a time as any to begin reclaiming my space. The Bennett family estate in Beacon Hill had been my home for 12 years, but as the car pulled through the wrought iron gates, it felt oddly unfamiliar, as if I were seeing it through new eyes. The neo-Georgian facade with its perfect symmetry, the meticulously maintained gardens, the subtle lighting that highlighted architectural features, all of it spoke to the careful curation of an image. Had I ever felt this was truly my home? Or had I, like Richard, been playing a role all these years, the perfect corporate wife, the gracious hostess, the supportive partner? As I unlocked the front door, I braced myself for a wave of emotion that never came. Instead, I felt curiously detached as I moved through the formal entryway into the main living areas. The house was silent, the staff having been given the day off after news of the previous night's drama had inevitably reached them. I bypassed the grand staircase leading to the master suite and headed instead for Edmund's study, a room Richard had wanted to renovate after his grandfather's death, but that I had insisted remain untouched. It was the one space in the house that had always felt authentic to me. Edmund's leather chair creaked as I settled into it, the familiar scent of books and the faint trace of his pipe tobacco providing unexpected comfort. On the wall opposite his desk hung a photograph I had always loved: Edmund as a young man standing proudly beside his first office building, his expression reflecting not arrogance, but quiet determination. He had built something lasting from nothing, guided by principles that Richard had never fully embraced. I wondered what he would make of the situation now, his grandson exposed as a fraud, his legacy protected by the woman he had handpicked as guardian, a Bennett heir on the way under the most unexpected circumstances. I poured myself a small measure of Edmund's favorite scotch from the decanter that still sat on his desk and raised it in a silent toast to the man who had seen something in me that I was only now beginning to recognize in myself. My phone buzzed with a text from Jeffrey. All necessary paperwork filed. Richard's resignation publicly announced as personal decision to pursue other opportunities. Interim leadership team in place. Call if you need anything. Then another from Vanessa. Saw the news about Richard stepping down. You okay? Guest? Room still available if you need sanctuary. I smiled at her concern but texted back, I'm home. Time to reclaim my space. Talk tomorrow? As I set my phone down, my gaze fell on Edmund's old leather journal lying on the corner of his desk. I had never opened it, respecting his privacy even after death, but something compelled me to reach for it now, as if it might contain wisdom, specifically meant for this moment. The journal fell open naturally to a page near the end, Edmund's distinctive handwriting filling the cream-colored paper. Signed the amended trust documents today. Eliza will have full control after I'm gone. Richard fought against it, of course, but fails to understand that this is protection, not punishment. She has the clearest vision of anyone in this family since my Margaret. When the storms come, and they will, Eliza will be the one to navigate through them. Richard would drive the ship straight onto the rocks, while insisting the waters were calm. Tears blurred my vision as I read his words he had never spoken to me directly but had committed to paper with absolute certainty. He had known, somehow, that this day would come. Had prepared for it. Had armed me with the authority to handle it. For 12 years, I had carefully constructed my identity around being Richard's wife, suppressing parts of myself that didn't fit neatly into that role. Now, as that identity crumbled, I was discovering that a stronger self had been waiting underneath, one that Edmund had recognized long before I did. Tomorrow would bring fresh challenges, another conversation with Melissa, formal divorce proceedings, to initiate, a company to help stabilize, a child's future to secure. But tonight, sitting in Edmund's chair with his journal open before me, I allowed myself to acknowledge a truth that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. The end of my marriage wasn't a failure, but a beginning. Not a loss, but a reclamation. For the first time in years, I was exactly where I needed to be. The morning light streamed through Edmund's study, where I had fallen asleep in his leather chair, the journal still open on my lap. For a moment I was disoriented, memories of the previous day flooding back in fragments. Richard's attempted embezzlement, the board meeting, Melissa's cryptic text about something else I should know. My phone showed 3 missed calls from my mother, undoubtedly concerned after news of Richard's resignation had hit the business pages. The Boston financial community was small and gossipy. By now, speculation would be rampant. After a quick shower and change of clothes, I made my way to the kitchen, surprised to find Mrs. Peterson, our longtime housekeeper, already preparing breakfast. I thought you might need a proper meal, she said, sliding a cup of coffee across the counter with the familiarity of someone who had known me for over a decade. The staff has been concerned. Thank you, Helen, I replied, gratefully, accepting the coffee. I appreciate you coming in. She hesitated, then added, Mr. Bennett collected his things from the guest house last night while you were out. He asked me to tell you he'll be staying at the Four Seasons until arrangements are finalized. So, Richard had chosen the city's most expensive hotel, a public statement that despite his professional setback, he remained a man of means and status. Typical. Did he say anything else? Only that some of his mail should be forwarded there. She paused, choosing her words carefully. And that the young lady who visited your birthday might be calling. I nearly laughed at the euphemism. The young lady who had exposed his double life was now reduced to a vague social connection. Thank you for letting me know. After breakfast, I called Jeffrey to check on the legal proceedings he'd initiated: trust amendments, formal documentation of Richard's resignation, preliminary divorce filings. Everything was proceeding smoothly. The financial audit team will have preliminary results by Friday, he informed me. Initial findings suggest Richard's attempted wire transfer wasn't his first attempt to move money inappropriately, just his most ambitious. Let me know what they find, I replied, unsurprised. Richard's bold attempt to transfer $12 million had likely been preceded by smaller, more discreet movements designed to test the system's vigilance. My next call was to Melissa, arranging to meet her at a quiet cafe near the public garden. At noon. Her voice had sounded strained, raising my curiosity about what additional information she needed to share. As I drove through the familiar streets of Boston, I was struck by how differently I perceived the city now. The financial district where Bennett & Sons maintained its headquarters, the exclusive shops on Newbury Street where Richard insisted we make appearances, the social clubs where we had cultivated carefully curated relationships. All of it had once represented a world I had worked to belong to. Now I recognized it as a beautiful but hollow stage set where we had all played our assigned roles. Melissa was already waiting when I arrived, seated at a corner table partially screened by a large ficus plant. She wore a simple maternity dress and minimal makeup, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. The transformation from the glamorous woman who had crashed my birthday party was striking. Without the armor of couture and careful styling, she looked younger, more vulnerable, but somehow more authentic. "Thank you for meeting me again," she said as I took the seat across from her. "I wasn't sure you would. Your message suggested there was something important I should know," I replied, ordering a sparkling water from the hovering waiter. She fidgeted with her napkin, clearly nervous. "Have you spoken with Richard since yesterday?" "No, I understand. He's taken a suite at the Four Seasons." She nodded, unsurprised. "He called me last night. He was not himself. Angry, accusatory, talking about how everyone had betrayed him." "That sounds entirely like himself, actually," I observed dryly. Richard has always excelled at positioning himself as the victim of others' actions rather than the architect of his own problems. A flicker of recognition crossed her face. "He said things would be different now, that plans had changed, but he had a new strategy." She looked up, meeting my eyes directly. "He wanted me to sign some papers." My instincts sharpened. What kind of papers? Legal documents. Something about being a beneficiary of a trust he was establishing. He said it would protect the baby and me if anything happened to him. She reached into her purse and withdrew a folded document. I told him I needed time to review them. That my brother is an attorney, and I wanted his opinion first. I took the papers, immediately recognizing the distinctive letterhead of Harrison and Myers, a law firm known for its aggressive tactics in high-net-worth divorces. As I scanned the document, cold anger settled in my chest. "This isn't a trust for your benefit," I explained, struggling to keep my voice even. "It's a declaration naming you as a co-respondent in divorce proceedings, claiming you knowingly pursued a relationship with a married man and conspired to extort financial support through pregnancy." The color drained from Melissa's face. "What? No, that's not—" "He told me it was protection for the baby." "If you had signed this, it would have given Richard leverage to claim I was financially persecuting both of you out of jealousy. It paints you as a knowing participant in an affair rather than someone who was deceived about his marital status." Tears welled in her eyes. "I almost signed it last night. He was so insistent, so convincing about how it would protect us." Her hand moved protectively to her belly. "I only hesitated because he seemed so different, angry, calculating. Not the man I thought I knew." "That is the man you know," I said gently. "The version you fell in love with was carefully crafted to gain your trust and affection. This I tapped the document. This is Richard without the mask. She wiped her eyes with a trembling hand. There's more. When I wouldn't sign immediately, he started making threats. Said if I didn't cooperate, he'd make sure I regretted it. That he had friends in family court who would ensure I lost custody once the baby was born. My jaw tightened. Richard's desperation was making him dangerous. Did he threaten you physically? No, nothing like that. Just legally, financially. Said no one would believe my version of events once his lawyers finished with me. She took a shaky breath. I was scared enough that I recorded the conversation on my phone. I stared at her, reassessing everything I thought I knew about this young woman. She had seemed naive, easily manipulated by Richard's charm and promises. But here she was, instinctively protecting herself with the same kind of careful documentation I had gathered during my investigation of Richard's financial misdeeds. That was incredibly smart, I told her sincerely, and brave. She looked surprised by the compliment. My mother always said, trust your gut. When Richard started making threats, something just clicked, like I was seeing the real him for the first time. I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. I had experienced that same moment of clarity, not when I discovered Richard's affair, but years earlier, when I first noticed the discrepancy between his words and actions, the careful construction of his public persona versus the private reality. Would you be willing to share that recording with my attorney? I asked. It could be significant in ensuring proper protections for you and your child. Yes, she said without hesitation. I want this baby to be safe, financially and emotionally. If Richard is willing to manipulate me like this, I can't trust him to be a proper father. As she sent the audio file to my phone, I considered the strange alliance forming between us, the wife and the mistress, united not by affection for each other, but by the shared experience of Richard's manipulation and a mutual concern for an innocent child. What will happen now? Melissa asked, echoing the question that had become a refrain throughout this unfolding drama. I'll have Jeffrey add this attempted manipulation to the divorce filing, I explained. We'll also expedite the establishment of a separate trust for your child's benefit, one that Richard cannot access or control. She nodded, relief evident in her expression. And what about us? This situation? I know it's awkward, but there's a child connecting us now, whether we like it or not. It was a fair question, one I had been avoiding in the whirlwind of legal and financial considerations. This woman would be the mother of a Bennett heir, a permanent connection to the family regardless of my relationship with Richard. I think we can establish a relationship based on mutual respect and the best interests of your child, I said. Carefully. I don't expect us to become friends, but we don't need to be adversaries either. I'd like that, she replied softly. And I want you to know how sorry I am about all of this. If I had known you were still married, that he was lying about his situation. I held up a hand, stopping her apology. You were deceived by someone who has elevated deception to an art form. I was married to him for 12 years and still missed crucial signs. I managed a wry smile. In fact, you did me a favor by showing up at my birthday. Without that catalyst, who knows how much longer his manipulation might have continued. As we left the cafe, I found myself contemplating the strange twists of fate that had brought us to this point. If someone had told me a week ago that I would be forming an alliance with my husband's pregnant mistress against him, I would have thought them insane. Yet here we were, two women reclaiming our power from the same man who had attempted to diminish us both. Walking back to my car through the public garden, I noticed the first hints of spring emerging. Tiny green buds on tree branches, crocuses pushing through the soil, life reasserting itself after the dormancy of winter. It seemed an apt metaphor for my own situation. After years of emotional hibernation in a marriage that had slowly drained my sense of self, I was experiencing the first stirrings of renewal. My phone buzzed with a text from William Porter. Board needs to discuss option for permanent leadership at B&S. Would value your input. Dinner tonight? I texted back my acceptance, recognizing that this request represented more than a business discussion. It was an acknowledgement that my role had fundamentally changed, from Richard's wife who happened to control the trust to a significant decision-maker in the Bennett financial empire in my own right. As I drove back toward Beacon Hill, I passed the Four Seasons where Richard was undoubtedly plotting his next move, believing as he always had that he could charm, manipulate, or bully his way back to a position of advantage. For the first time, I felt no anxiety about what schemes he might be developing, no fear that he might somehow reclaim control. The document Melissa had nearly signed revealed the depth of his desperation, a clumsy attempt to create an alliance, with his mistress against his wife, not understanding that his manipulation of both women had created a stronger bond between us than anything he could offer either of us now. The realization brought with it not satisfaction or vindication, but a profound sense of peace. Whatever happened next, I was no longer defined by my relationship to Richard Bennett. I was Eliza, executor, board member, decision-maker, and increasingly, my own person. 3 months after the night Melissa walked into my birthday celebration, I stood in the newly renovated offices of Bennett & Sons, surveying the changes that had transformed not just the physical space, but the company itself. Gone were the dark wood paneling and heavy draperies that had given the executive floor its clubby, exclusive atmosphere. In their place, glass walls allowed natural light to flow through the space, creating an environment of transparency and openness. The last of the artwork is being installed today, Charlotte Weber informed me as she handed over the morning's correspondence. After 30 years as the firm's executive assistant, she had become my most trusted ally in navigating the cultural transition underway at Bennett & Sons. Thank you, Charlotte. And the quarterly reports? Ready for your review. The renewable energy portfolio is performing particularly well, up 22% since implementation. I nodded, pleased but not surprised. The shift toward sustainable investments had been my first major initiative after assuming operational leadership of the firm. Richard had consistently blocked such moves, claiming they were too speculative, too risky for Bennett & Sons' traditional client base. In reality, he had been protecting his personal investments in competing sectors, another deception revealed during the comprehensive audit of his financial activities. The boardroom, once Richard's domain, now served as a collaborative workspace, where senior managers gathered weekly to share insights and challenges. Today, the leadership team was assembling to finalize our first major acquisition since Richard's departure, a boutique investment firm specializing in women-led startups. As I took my seat at the head of the table, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the glass wall, a woman I was still getting to know. My hair, once carefully maintained in the conservative style Richard had preferred, now fell in looser waves around my face. My wardrobe had evolved too, still professional but with touches of color and personality that would have seemed out of place in my former life as Mrs. Bennett. Quarterly projections are exceeding expectations across all divisions, William Porter reported, his initial skepticism about my leadership long since replaced by firm support. Client retention is at 98%, and we've added 23 new accounts, in the high net worth category. The Richardson Group is particularly impressed with our sustainable portfolio, added Victoria Harrington. They're considering moving their entire family office under our management. The meeting progressed efficiently, each department head reporting successes and challenges with a candor that would have been unthinkable during Richard's tenure, when admitting problems was seen as weakness rather than an opportunity for collaborative problem-solving. As the team dispersed to their respective departments, William lingered behind. The whispers have stopped, he noted, pouring himself a cup of coffee from the sideboard. For the first few weeks after Richard left, There was plenty of speculation about how long you'd last before selling your stake or bringing in outside management. Now no one questions your leadership. Results tend to silence critics, I replied, gathering my notes. Though I'm sure there are still those who believe a former corporate wife has no business running an investment firm. William chuckled. Perhaps, but they're not saying it anywhere I can hear. Edmund would be pleased with what you've accomplished. The mention of Richard's grandfather brought a familiar warmth. I'd taken to visiting his grave monthly, updating him on the company's progress as if he could still offer the guidance I'd valued during his life. After the meeting, I returned to what had been Richard's office, now transformed into a space that reflected my own aesthetic. The pretentious oil paintings of sailing vessels had been replaced with contemporary works by local artists. The imposing mahogany desk where Richard had held court was gone, replaced by a more functional workspace, arranged to facilitate conversation rather than intimidate visitors. My phone buzzed with a text from Melissa. Appointment went well. It's a girl. Pictures attached if you want to see them. Our unexpected alliance had evolved into something neither of us could have anticipated. Not friendship exactly, but a relationship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. The trust, for her child, Richard's daughter, had been established with provisions for education, healthcare, and financial security. Richard, true to form, had initially contested the arrangements, then abruptly shifted to disinterest when he realized there was no advantage to be gained. I opened the attached ultrasound image, studying the grainy profile of the tiny Bennett heir, a girl who would grow up knowing her full family history, both the triumphs and the failures. Melissa and I had agreed on that much. No sanitized version of events, no convenient lies to protect adult egos. She's beautiful, I texted back. Have you thought more about names? Leaning toward Eleanor Grace. Eleanor was my grandmother's name. I smiled at the coincidence. Eleanor had been Edmund's wife's name as well. Whether intentional or not, Melissa had chosen a name that connected her daughter to the Bennett legacy in a way Richard would likely never appreciate. My intercom buzzed. Mrs. Bennett, your mother is here. I winced slightly at the continued use of my married name, a detail I hadn't yet corrected, partly due to the complicated legal proceedings still underway, and partly because, in Boston's financial circles, the Bennett name carried weight that opened doors. Send her in, please. Elizabeth Prescott entered with her characteristic blend of elegance and energy, kissing me on both cheeks before settling into one of the visitor chairs. At 68, she remained a formidable presence in Boston's social scene, though she had deliberately stepped back from her philanthropic commitments to support me through the upheaval of recent months. The office looks wonderful, she commented, glancing approvingly at the transformed space. Much more you than that mausoleum Richard insisted upon. The whole floor has been renovated, I told her. We're bringing Bennett and Sons into the current century, figuratively and literally. And how are you, darling? Beyond the professional successes everyone is talking about. It was the question people rarely asked, focusing instead on the business, implications of Richard's departure, or the salacious details of his double life. I'm finding my way, I answered honestly. Some days are easier than others. She nodded, understanding the complexities behind my simple response. And the divorce proceedings? Ongoing. Richard's latest attorney is taking a more aggressive approach, challenging the trust provisions and claiming Edmund was not of sound mind when he appointed me executor. My mother scoffed. Edmund Bennett was sharper at 80 than Richard is at 45. That argument won't stand up to the slightest scrutiny. It's not meant to succeed, just to delay and frustrate me into a more favorable settlement. I shrugged, no longer particularly concerned by Richard's legal maneuvers. Jeffrey assures me it's a desperate tactic that will backfire. And Melissa, how is she managing? Better than expected. She's enrolled in a business program at Boston University, focusing on event management. The trust will provide for her child, and she seems determined to build an independent life. My mother studied me thoughtfully. You've handled this situation with remarkable grace, Eliza. Many women would have vilified both husband and mistress, made the whole mess as publicly painful as possible. What purpose would that serve? The situation was painful enough without adding vindictiveness to the mix. I glanced at the ultrasound image still open on my phone. Besides, there's a child involved. She deserves better than to be born into active hostility. Edmund chose well when he put you in charge, my mother said softly. Not just of the money, but of the family's future. After my mother left, I found myself reflecting on the journey of the past 3 months. From the shock of Melissa's appearance at my birthday to the comprehensive restructuring of both Bennett and Sons and my personal life. The path had been neither straight nor easy, with Richard fighting each step of the separation and attempting to undermine my leadership at every opportunity. Yet something unexpected had emerged from the chaos, a clearer sense of who I was beyond the roles I had played as Richard's wife, Edmund's chosen executor, the perfect hostess, the supportive partner. Those aspects of my identity remained, but they no longer defined me completely. My assistant appeared in the doorway. Your car is ready whenever you're set to leave. Thank you, David. I'll head out now. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Boston Common as my driver navigated toward Cambridge. Harvard Business School had invited me to speak to their Women in Leadership seminar, a request that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago when I was known primarily as Richard Bennett's wife, rather than the interim CEO of Bennett & Sons Investment Group. Tonight, I would share not just the professional insights gained from restructuring a traditional investment firm for contemporary challenges, but also the personal wisdom hard-won through betrayal, resilience, and reinvention. As the car crossed the Charles River, I reviewed my speaking notes, focusing on the conclusion that had taken the longest to craft. The measure of our success is not found in the absence of challenges, but in how we respond to them. When my carefully constructed life imploded, I discovered that what remained wasn't emptiness but possibility. The structures I had relied upon, marriage, social position, defined roles, had actually been limitations disguised as security. True security comes not from external validation, but from internal clarity about who you are and what you value. My journey continues, as all our journeys do. But now I move forward not as someone defined by relationship to others, but as myself, complex, capable, and continuously evolving. The words reflected not just what I hoped to convey to the ambitious young women who would fill the auditorium tonight, but what I was still learning to embrace fully myself, that endings, however painful, create space for new beginnings. My phone buzzed with a calendar reminder. Dinner with Vanessa, 8:30 p.m. After my talk, I would meet my oldest friend to celebrate a milestone neither of us had anticipated. The board's decision, finalized that morning, to remove interim from my CEO title. Life continued to unfold in unexpected ways. The woman, who had once believed her greatest achievement was maintaining a perfect facade, as Mrs. Richard Bennett was now recognized as a financial leader in her own right. The marriage I had fought to preserve had been revealed as a carefully constructed illusion, and the woman I had initially seen as my replacement had become, improbably, an ally in creating a healthier legacy for the next generation. Not every question had been answered, not every wound healed. Richard remained a complicated presence in my life through ongoing legal proceedings and his biological connection to Eleanor Grace, the daughter he had yet to acknowledge beyond mandatory DNA. Testing, the social circles we had moved in together continued to adjust to our separate realities, allies and loyalties shifting like the New England weather. But as I prepared to address a room full of women navigating their own complex paths through personal and professional challenges, I felt a profound gratitude for the unexpected turn my life had taken. The night Melissa walked into my birthday celebration had been the end of one chapter, but it had also been the beginning of a far more authentic story, one I was now writing for myself. Before we continue with how my transformation journey unfolded, I want to thank all of you for your supportive comments on this series. So many of you have shared your own stories of rebuilding after betrayal, and it's been incredibly moving to read them. I've noticed many of you asking about what eventually happened with Richard and whether there was one final confrontation. Well, today's installment will answer those questions. And if you're new here, welcome. Make sure you check out the earlier parts of this story to understand how we got to this point. Now, let's pick up where we left off. The Harvard Business School auditorium fell silent as I concluded my presentation, the final slide displaying a simple quote from Eleanor Roosevelt. "A woman is like a tea bag. You never know how strong it is until it's in hot water." For a moment, I stood in the stillness, acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes focused on me, women at various stages of their careers, many taking notes, others nodding in recognition of struggles similar to their own. Then applause erupted, starting in the front rows and cascading backward through the hall. During the Q&A session that followed, the questions ranged from specific business strategies I'd implemented at Bennett & Sons to more personal inquiries about navigating Boston's male-dominated financial sector. But it was the final question, posed by a young woman in the back row, that caught me off guard with its directness. "Ms. Bennett, you've spoken eloquently about professional resilience, but I'm curious, how do you handle running into your ex-husband socially? Boston's financial community is small, and it seems inevitable that your paths would cross." The room grew quieter, the audience clearly interested in this more personal dimension of my story. I took a moment before responding, appreciating her candor. "That's an excellent question," I acknowledged. "The truth is, Richard and I haven't directly interacted since the day he cleared out his office at Bennett & Sons. Our communication has been exclusively through attorneys. Boston may be small, but when someone puts significant effort into avoiding you, it's surprisingly easy to maintain distance." What I didn't share was my suspicion that Richard had been deliberately keeping a low profile, waiting for the gossip to subside before attempting to rebuild his reputation. According to Vanessa's extensive network of social connections, he had been spotted in New York and Miami, but had largely disappeared from Boston's social calendar. After the talk concluded, the department chair invited me to join a small dinner with faculty members and select students. As we walked toward the faculty club, my phone buzzed with a text from Vanessa. "Change of plans. Need to meet earlier. Stratton Club in 30 minutes important." The urgency was uncharacteristic of my typically laid-back friend. I made my apologies to the Harvard group and directed my driver to the Stratton Club instead, an exclusive establishment in Back Bay, where Boston's old money gathered away from tourist attention. Vanessa was waiting in the private lounge area, a half-empty martini in front of her, and an expression I hadn't seen since her messy divorce 3 years earlier. A mixture of anger and satisfaction that suggested significant drama was unfolding. "What's happened?" I asked, sliding into the leather chair across from her. "Your text sounded urgent." She leaned forward, lowering her voice despite the privacy of our corner. "Richard's back in town, and he's brought company," I signaled. The waiter for a scotch absorbing this information. Not entirely surprising, he was bound to return eventually. "It's who he's with that's interesting," Vanessa continued, a gleam in her eye that reminded me why she had been my first call when Melissa appeared at my birthday party. Vanessa had a journalist's instinct for significant details. Diane Lockhart, the name registered immediately. Diane Lockhart was the recently divorced wife of Henry Lockhart, CEO of Eastern Capital Group, and one of Bennett & Sons' largest competitors. "That's an interesting choice," I said carefully, accepting my drink from the waiter. "Interesting. doesn't begin to cover it, Vanessa replied once we were alone again. Eastern Capital has been trying to poach Bennett clients for years, and now Richard's parading around town with the ex-wife of their CEO? It's not subtle. I considered the implications. Richard had signed comprehensive non-compete and confidentiality agreements as part of his separation from Bennett and Sons. The legal terms were stringent, necessary protective measures given his intricate knowledge of client portfolios and investment strategies. Where were they seen? I asked, keeping my tone neutral despite the concern building within me. Dinner at Maison Laurent tonight. Very cozy, according to my source. And they're staying at the same hotel, the Archer, not Richard's usual Four Seasons. A deliberate choice, then. The Archer was directly across the street from Eastern Capital's Boston offices. There's more, Vanessa added, finishing her martini. Diane Lockhart sits on Eastern's board, specifically their new acquisitions committee. The pieces aligned with disturbing clarity. Richard couldn't directly work for a competitor due to his non-compete agreement, but there was nothing preventing him from sharing insider information with a board member who happened to be his new romantic interest. It was exactly the kind of underhanded workaround that reflected Richard's approach to obstacles, not confronting them directly, but finding deceptive paths around them. I should call Jeffrey, I said, reaching for my phone. Vanessa placed her hand over mine, stopping me. There's something else you should know first. They're here. Here? At the Stratton? She nodded toward the main dining room visible through the lounge's glass partition. They arrived about 10 minutes before. You did. Richard didn't see me. I was seated behind a column when they were escorted to their table. I followed her gaze, and there he was. My husband of 12 years, soon-to-be ex, seated at a prime table overlooking the garden. Across from him sat Diane Lockhart, an elegant woman in her early 50s with the confident posture of someone accustomed to wealth and influence. Richard was leaning toward her, that familiar charming smile in place as he spoke animatedly. It was the first time I'd seen him in person since he'd cleared out his office 3 months earlier. I had expected to feel something, anger, resentment, perhaps even lingering affection. Instead, I experienced a strange detachment, as if observing a character in a play rather than a man who had once been the center of my life. We should leave, I said, turning back to Vanessa. I have no interest in a public scene. Or, Vanessa countered with a mischievous glint, we could join them. Absolutely not. Not literally at their table, she clarified. But the Connollys are hosting a group in the private dining section, and they'd be delighted to have us join. Their table has a perfect view of the main room. I considered the proposition. Deliberately positioning myself to observe Richard felt petty, yet I couldn't deny a certain strategic advantage in seeing him interact with Diane Lockhart. If he was indeed planning to circumvent his non-compete through her, witnessing their dynamic might provide valuable insight. Fine, I conceded. But we're there as guests of the Connollys, not as spies. Of course, Vanessa agreed, her innocent tone belied by the satisfaction in her eyes. Purely social. Thomas and Marion, Connolly welcomed us warmly to their gathering, a celebration of their 40th anniversary with a small circle of friends. From our position, I had a clear view of Richard and Diane without being directly in his line of sight. Throughout dinner, I found myself making professional small talk while periodically observing Richard's table. His body language was familiar. The animated gestures, the focused attention, the well-timed laugh that made whoever he was speaking with feel uniquely interesting. I had once been the recipient of that calculated charm, had once believed it represented genuine connection rather than strategic manipulation. They make an attractive couple, Marion Connolly noted, following my gaze. Though I'm surprised to see Richard with Diane Lockhart, of all people, given the history between Bennett and Eastern. Richard has always valued his personal interests above professional boundaries, I replied, keeping my tone light despite the weight of the observation. Marian patted my hand sympathetically. You've handled everything with remarkable dignity, Eliza. The entire community has noticed. The support was genuine but uncomfortable, reminding me that despite my professional accomplishments, many in Boston society still viewed me primarily through the lens of my failed marriage, the wronged wife who had behaved admirably in the face of humiliation. As dessert was served, I noticed Richard and Diane preparing to leave. He helped her with her wrap in a gallant gesture I recognized all too well, his hand lingering at the small of her back as they moved toward the exit. Then, halfway across the dining room, Richard froze. Our eyes met across the crowded space, his widening in surprise before his expression smoothed into careful neutrality. He whispered something to Diane, who glanced in my direction with unconcealed curiosity. I maintained steady eye contact, offering a polite nod of acknowledgement. For a moment, Richard seemed unsure how to respond, an unusual state for a man who prided himself on social adroitness. Then he returned the nod stiffly, before guiding Diane toward the exit with renewed purpose. Well, that was anticlimactic, Vanessa murmured beside me. I was hoping for something more dramatic. Life isn't a reality show, I reminded her, though I understood her disappointment. After all the pain and betrayal, our first post-separation encounter had been nothing more than a brief exchange of nods across a crowded room. Yet, as I reflected on it later that evening, I recognized the significance of that mundane interaction. 3 months ago, seeing Richard with another woman would have provoked intense emotional turmoil. Now, I felt only a detached concern about potential business implications, not personal hurt. The encounter hadn't been dramatic precisely because I had moved beyond the need for confrontation or validation. The following morning, I arrived at Bennett & Sons earlier than usual, summoning Jeffrey and our head of security for an urgent meeting. If Richard was indeed planning to use Diane Lockhart as a conduit for proprietary information, we needed to implement additional safeguards immediately. We'll need to conduct a comprehensive security audit, Jeffrey advised after I explained the situation. Phone records, system access logs, document trails. If Richard has been sharing sensitive information, we need to know exactly what's been compromised. I'll alert the IT team to look for any unusual access patterns or data exports from before Richard's departure, added Michael Reeves, our security director. We should also consider changing all client-facing protocols as a precaution. As they outlined protective measures, I found myself reflecting on Richard's consistent pattern, the creation of new problems requiring my attention and resources, even months after his departure. His presence in my life had become like a chronic condition, manageable but never fully resolved, requiring periodic intervention to prevent flare-ups. Later that day, as I reviewed the preliminary security findings in Edmund's study, which I had maintained as a personal retreat within the Bennett estate, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Eliza Bennett speaking. Mrs. Bennett, this is Brian Lockhart. I believe we have a mutual concern we should discuss. I recognized the name immediately, Henry Lockhart's son and Eastern Capital's chief strategy officer. Mr. Lockhart, this is unexpected. Call me Brian, please. His tone was cordial but businesslike. I'd like to meet with you regarding Richard Bennett's relationship with my stepmother. Would tomorrow morning at Riverview Coffee be convenient? Say 8 o'clock? The request was unusual enough to pique my interest. I'll be there. As I ended the call, I wondered what new complication was unfolding in the already complex aftermath of my marriage. Whatever Brian Lockhart wanted to discuss, it seemed the final chapter of my history with Richard was still being written. Riverview Coffee occupied a quiet corner near the Charles River, its understated facade and lack of prominent signage ensuring it remained a sanctuary for those seeking discretion rather than recognition. I arrived 15 minutes early, selecting a table in the back alcove that offered both privacy and a clear view of the entrance. Brian Lockhart arrived precisely at 8, his appearance less formal than I'd expected. Dark jeans, a cashmere sweater, and rimless glasses that gave him a scholarly look at odds with his reputation as Eastern Capital's most aggressive strategist. At 35, he was a decade younger than Richard, and had built a career deliberately separate from his father's influence, starting at Goldman Sachs before joining the family firm. "Mrs. Bennet," he greeted me, extending his hand. "Thank you for meeting on such short notice." "Eliza, please," I replied, assessing him with professional curiosity, though I'm still trying to understand why the chief strategy officer of our largest competitor wants to meet with me. He smiled, a quick, economical expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Direct. I appreciate that." He signaled the waiter for coffee before continuing. "I'll be equally direct. Richard Bennet is using my stepmother to access Eastern Capital's acquisition strategy and simultaneously using his knowledge of Bennet & Sons to advise her on competitive moves against your firm." The bluntness of his statement confirmed my suspicions while raising new questions. "And you're sharing this with me because while Eastern and Bennet are competitors, we're both being manipulated by someone who respects neither firm's boundaries nor legacy." His coffee arrived, and he took a moment to add a precise amount of cream. "My father and I disagree on many things, but we align on protecting Eastern from outside exploitation. I assume Diane doesn't share your concern." Brian's expression tightened. "Diane married my father when I was in college. Their divorce was acrimonious. She retained her board seat as part of the settlement, primarily to irritate him. Her relationship with Richard seems similarly motivated by spite rather than affection." "That aligns with Richard's pattern," I acknowledged. "He's drawn to situations where he can position himself as instrumental to someone else's agenda." Brian nodded. "Precisely. He's offering Diane insider knowledge of Bennett's operations to help her outmaneuver my father, while simultaneously gathering information about Eastern strategies. It's an elegant manipulation, targeting her desire for revenge while serving his own interests." The assessment was perceptive and unsettlingly accurate in capturing Richard's modus operandi. He had always excelled at identifying others' vulnerabilities and positioning himself as uniquely capable of addressing them, whether in business or personal relationships. "What exactly are you proposing, Brian?" He leaned forward, lowering his voice despite the privacy of our location. "A coordinated response. Diane's access at Eastern is limited but significant, focused on acquisition targets. Richard's knowledge of Bennet is comprehensive but increasingly outdated as you implement changes. Together, they're dangerous. Separately, they're manageable. And how do we separate them? By offering each what the other is pretending to provide." He reached into his messenger bag and withdrew a slim folder. "This contains evidence that Richard has been simultaneously approaching Eastern's acquisition targets with counteroffers based on information from Diane. He's effectively playing both sides." I examined the documents, email exchanges, meeting, notes, tracked movements showing Richard visiting companies on Eastern's acquisition shortlist soon after Diane's board reviews. Why not take this directly to Diane? Because Richard has convinced her that I'm attempting to undermine her board position at my father's direction. She wouldn't believe anything coming from me. His expression revealed genuine frustration. "But she might listen to you, another woman who's experienced Richard's manipulation firsthand." I considered the proposition carefully. Engaging directly with Diane Lockhart carried risks, both personally and professionally. Yet the evidence before me suggested Richard was escalating from merely unethical behavior to potentially illegal corporate espionage. "What would your father say about this unorthodox alliance between competitors?" Brian's smile was wry. "He doesn't know I'm here. My father believes in crushing opponents, not collaborating with them." but I've studied Bennett and Sons' trajectory under your leadership. You're steering towards sustainable investments and boutique services that complement, rather than directly compete with Eastern's primary markets. There's room for both firms to thrive without this destructive espionage. His analysis of my strategic direction was surprisingly accurate, reflecting either thorough research or genuine insight. Either way, it suggested he was approaching this potential alliance with thoughtful consideration rather than reactive impulse. If I were to speak with Diane, what exactly would I be proposing? Nothing, just sharing information she needs to make an informed decision about her association with Richard. He tapped the folder. This evidence, combined with your personal experience, should be sufficient. What she does with that knowledge is her choice. The approach was elegant, in its simplicity, not attempting to control Diane's response, but simply ensuring she had complete information about Richard's duplicity. It respected her agency while addressing the immediate threat to both firms. And what do you get from this arrangement? Besides protection for Eastern's acquisition strategy? Brian hesitated, then offered a more genuine smile. Honestly? Professional? Curiosity satisfied. You've transformed Bennett and Sons more in 3 months than most CEOs accomplish in years. I'm interested in seeing what you'll do next, without Richard's interference. The compliment seemed sincere, though I maintained healthy skepticism about his motives. Still, his proposal offered a potential resolution to Richard's latest manipulation with minimal risk to Bennett and Sons. I'll need to verify this information independently, I said, indicating the folder. I'd expect nothing less. My contact information is inside. Once you've confirmed the details, let me know if you decide to proceed. After Brian left, I remained at the table, reviewing the evidence he'd provided while processing the implications of this unexpected development. If accurate, the documents suggested Richard had escalated from opportunistic deception to calculated corporate sabotage, behavior that crossed legal boundaries and could have significant repercussions for both him and Diane if exposed. More concerning was what these actions revealed about Richard's state of mind. Rather than rebuilding his life post-separation, he seemed intent on destructive schemes motivated by revenge or desperation. The man I'd married had been manipulative, but had operated within certain ethical boundaries. This new version of Richard appeared unmoored from such constraints. My contemplation was interrupted by a text from Jeffrey. Security audit preliminary results complete. Evidence of unauthorized access to client files before R's departure. Call when available. The confirmation of Richard's malfeasance solidified my decision. I would need to act decisively to protect both Bennett and Sons and, ironically, Eastern Capital from Richard's increasingly reckless behavior. As I gathered the documents, a notification appeared on my phone, a reminder for tomorrow's appointment with Melissa for the baby's 7-month checkup. Amid the corporate intrigue and strategic maneuvering, this simple reminder centered me. While Richard spiraled into increasingly self-destructive patterns, I was helping prepare for the arrival of his daughter, a child he had yet to acknowledge beyond legally required paternity confirmation. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Richard was channeling his considerable talents into revenge and manipulation, while I was focusing on creation and growth, both at Bennett and Sons and in preparing for Eleanor Grace's arrival. The realization brought unexpected clarity about what truly mattered in the aftermath of our marriage's collapse. Back at Bennett and Sons, I reviewed the security audit with Jeffrey and our IT director, confirming that Richard had indeed accessed confidential client information shortly before his departure. The pattern aligned precisely with Brian Lockhart's evidence, suggesting Richard had been planning this corporate espionage while still serving as a Bennett executive. This crosses from unethical to illegal, Jeffrey noted grimly. We have grounds for criminal charges. Let's hold that option in reserve, I decided. First, I want to meet with Diane Lockhart. If she's unaware of the extent of Richard's manipulation, she deserves the opportunity to extricate herself before legal proceedings commence. Jeffrey raised an eyebrow. A surprisingly compassionate approach, given the circumstances. It's not compassion, I clarified. It's strategy. Criminal charges create public spectacle that could damage client confidence in both firms. If Diane ends her association with Richard and Eastern implements the same security protocols we're establishing, we contain the damage while maintaining the option for legal action if necessary. The solution reflected my evolving leadership approach: firm, but not punitive, strategic rather than reactive. Edmund had operated with similar principles, understanding that long-term success required wisdom about when to strike and when to show restraint. Arranging a meeting with Diane proved simpler than anticipated. A brief, carefully worded email mentioning mutual concerns regarding Richard Bennett received a response within the hour, suggesting tea at her Beacon Hill brownstone the following afternoon. That evening, as I prepared for what would undoubtedly be a delicate conversation, Melissa called with updates from her doctor's appointment. "Everything looks perfect," she reported, her voice reflecting growing excitement about the baby. "The doctor says she's right on track for her January due date." "That's wonderful news," I replied, genuinely pleased. "How are you feeling?" "Huge," she laughed, "but otherwise good. The business courses are keeping me busy in a positive way." She paused before adding, "Richard called yesterday. First time in weeks." My attention sharpened. What did he want? To discuss trust arrangements for the baby. He suddenly seems concerned about financial provisions, asking detailed questions about the structure you established. Her tone reflected healthy skepticism. It seemed odd, given his previous disinterest. The timing aligned too perfectly with his involvement with Diane to be coincidental. Richard's renewed interest in his unborn child's trust might indicate he was seeking another angle to access Bennett funds or information. Has he asked to meet in person? Yes, suggested dinner next week to discuss the future amicably. The eye roll was audible in her voice. I told him I'd think about it. That's wise, I commended her caution. When he calls again, it might be helpful to mention that any changes to the trust require my approval as executor. A strategic disclosure that would signal to Richard that Melissa and I remained in communication, potentially derailing whatever new scheme he was developing. After we ended the call, I sat in Edmund's study, connecting threads from the disparate interactions of the past 24 hours. Richard's simultaneous pursuits, corporate espionage with Diane, renewed interest in Melissa's trust, suggested a man desperately seeking leverage or resources. The question was why. Richard's monthly allowance from the Bennett Trust remained generous despite the reductions I'd implemented. His professional reputation had been damaged, but not destroyed by his resignation. What was driving this escalation of risky behavior? The answer emerged from an unexpected source the following morning: a call from our bank's private client, Services Director. "Mrs. Bennett, we've flagged some concerning activity related to accounts previously accessible to your husband. Multiple wire transfer attempts to offshore entities, all rejected due to insufficient validation." When did these attempts occur? The most recent was yesterday afternoon, all from different locations, using credentials that would have been valid before your security updates. The pattern suggested mounting desperation, Richard repeatedly attempting to access funds he could no longer reach. But why the urgency? What financial pressure was he facing that his trust allowance couldn't address? As I prepared to meet Diane Lockhart later that day, I realized I was approaching the conversation with incomplete information. Richard's behavior pointed to a man under significant pressure, yet the nature of that pressure remained unclear. Understanding it might be crucial to effectively addressing the threat he now posed to both Bennett and Sons, and increasingly to himself. Diane Lockhart's Beacon Hill residence reflected its owner, elegant, sophisticated, with an underlying hardness revealed in the severe angles of modern furniture against traditional architecture. She greeted me with the practiced cordiality of Boston's social elite, leading me to a sunroom overlooking an immaculately maintained garden. "I must admit, I was intrigued by your request," Diane said as she poured tea from a silver service. "Richard speaks of you rarely, and never in terms that suggested a civilized conversation between us was likely." "I imagine not," I replied, accepting the delicate porcelain cup. "Though I suspect we've both heard carefully curated versions of many truths from Richard." A flicker of curiosity crossed her face. "You're more direct than he described. One advantage of losing everything you thought defined you is the freedom to be authentic afterward," I observed, deliberately establishing a connection through our shared experience of marital dissolution. "Your home is lovely, by the way. Post-divorce acquisitions often reflect our truest tastes." The comment elicited a genuine smile. Henry always insisted on dreary antiques, family legacy, and all that. "The first thing I did after the settlement was put them in storage and buy furniture I actually wanted to live with." The moment of connection established, I shifted toward the purpose of my visit. "I suspect Richard has presented himself as uniquely positioned to help you achieve certain objectives regarding Eastern Capital." Her expression cooled instantly. "I don't discuss my personal relationships or business matters with strangers, Mrs. Bennet, even ones who pour excellent tea." I placed the folder Brian had provided on the table between us. "I understand completely. Privacy matters. So does having accurate information before making decisions that could have significant consequences." She eyed the folder warily. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "Only that Richard has a consistent pattern of telling each person in his life exactly what they need to hear to serve his purposes, while withholding critical information that might lead them to different conclusions." I gestured toward the documents. "These suggest he's simultaneously advising you on moves against Eastern while using that information to approach Eastern's acquisition targets with competing offers." Diane's hand hesitated over the folder, conflicting impulses visible in her expression. "And I should believe these documents from you, someone with obvious motivation to discredit him, rather than a man I've come to know intimately over the past months?" "You shouldn't believe either of us implicitly," I countered, "but you should verify independently. Your board position gives you access to records of Eastern's preliminary acquisition discussions. Check the dates against Richard's whereabouts. Ask yourself why a man who signed a non-compete agreement with severe financial penalties would risk meeting with companies on Eastern's target list unless he had something significant to gain or something substantial to fear." The last phrase caught her attention. To fear? I hadn't planned to share this speculation, but her perceptiveness created an opening I hadn't anticipated. "Richard has been attempting to transfer funds to offshore accounts, significant amounts beyond what his current income would support. He's also suddenly showing interest in his unborn child's trust fund after months of indifference. These behaviors suggest financial pressure beyond normal circumstances." Diane's expression shifted, a barely perceptible tightening around her eyes. "That's an interesting observation." Something in her tone suggested more knowledge than she was admitting. I decided to take a calculated risk. "Diane, I'm not here to damage your relationship with Richard or to relitigate my marriage. I'm here because whatever is driving his current behavior poses risks to Bennett and Sons, to Eastern Capital, and potentially to Richard himself. If you know what's behind this escalation, sharing that information might help prevent a situation that damages all involved." She studied me for a long moment, seemingly reassessing her initial impression. Finally, she reached for the folder, opening it to scan the contents with practiced efficiency. Her expression remained neutral, but I noticed her hand tighten on the page as she reviewed certain details. "These could be fabricated," she said, but her tone lacked conviction. "They could be," I agreed, "but you know they aren't. Richard's pattern is too consistent for these to be coincidental." She closed the folder deliberately, her decision made. Richard came to me initially claiming he wanted to explore investment opportunities independent of Bennett constraints. Our personal relationship developed later. About a month ago, he mentioned financial difficulties, gambling debts to private parties who don't extend generous payment terms. The revelation clicked several pieces into place. Richard's gambling issues had surfaced periodically throughout our marriage, always followed by promises of reform. Edmund had been aware of the problem, which explained certain restrictive provisions in the trust structure. "How much does he owe?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. $7 million, according to him, due by the end of next month. She smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her impeccable linen pants. He assured me the situation was temporary, that once certain investments materialized, he would resolve the debt without my assistance. Those investments being information he could leverage from both Bennett and Eastern, I concluded. She nodded, her expression hardening. "It seems I've been played as thoroughly as his previous targets. How unoriginal of me." Richard excels at identifying exactly what each person desires and positioning himself as uniquely capable of providing it, I said, recognizing an unexpected kinship with this woman I'd initially viewed as an adversary. "For you, perhaps it was insider knowledge that would help you maintain influence at Eastern despite your divorce. While for you, it was the promise of a partnership of equals that somehow always prioritized his ambitions," she finished, surprising me with her perception. "Henry operated similarly. Perhaps we both have patterns worth examining." The observation, though uncomfortably accurate, created a foundation for candid discussion. For the next hour, Diane and I compared experiences, identifying the manipulation techniques Richard had employed with both of us. Despite our different circumstances, the similarities were striking, the initial charm giving way to subtle control, the gradual isolation from outside perspectives, the clever way he positioned himself as essential to our success. "What will you do now?" I asked, as our conversation drew to a close. She smiled thinly. "Exactly what Henry would least expect. Contact him directly about Richard's approaches to Eastern's acquisition targets. Family dysfunction aside, we built Eastern together. Neither of us wants to see it damaged by an outside opportunist." "And Richard?" "I believe we both have conversations pending with him," she replied, rising gracefully to signal the end of our meeting. "Though I suspect yours will be more consequential given your control of the resources he so desperately needs." As I left Diane's home, I felt a curious sense of completion, as if a circle had been drawn connecting all the women Richard had attempted to manipulate. First Melissa, now Diane, each of us initially isolated in our separate spheres of his influence, now sharing information and perspective that revealed the complete picture of his deceptions. The confrontation with Richard occurred sooner than I'd anticipated. When I returned to the Bennett estate that evening, his car was parked in the circular driveway, the flashy Aston Martin he'd purchased with trust funds shortly before our separation. He sat on the front steps, his normally immaculate appearance showing signs of strain, stubble shadowing his jaw, his designer shirt wrinkled as if he'd been wearing it for days. "Breaking and entering is still illegal, regardless of our marital status," I called as I approached, maintaining a safe distance. His disheveled appearance and desperate circumstances made him unpredictable. "It's still legally my residence until the divorce is finalized," he countered, rising unsteadily. The slight slur in his voice suggested he'd been drinking. "We need to talk, Eliza." "About your gambling debts? Or about your corporate espionage involving Diane Lockhart? Perhaps your sudden interest in Melissa's trust fund? You've been quite busy." I remained near my car, keys in hand, phone accessible. His eyes narrowed. "Been comparing notes, have you? The 3 women in Richard's life, forming a little support group?" "Information has a way of surfacing when you're deceiving multiple people simultaneously," I replied calmly. The effort required to maintain separate narratives eventually becomes unsustainable. He laughed bitterly, always so analytical, so controlled. Did it ever occur to you that your emotional detachment might have driven me to seek connection elsewhere? The attempted deflection was so transparent, so classically Richard, that I found myself pitying rather than resenting him. No, Richard, it didn't. Because I recognize manipulation when I hear it now. Your choices were your own, driven by your needs and insecurities, not by my alleged shortcomings. He stepped toward me, his composed facade crumbling. I need access to the trust principal, just temporarily. 7 million secured against my future disbursements. Once I clear this debt, everything can return to normal. Normal, I repeated, the word hollow in the gathering twilight. Which version of normal are you envisioning? The one where you maintain a double life with a pregnant mistress? Or the one where you exploit your relationship with Diane Lockhart to damage two financial institutions? Perhaps the one where you attempt to embezzle client funds? His expression darkened. You've never understood the pressures I face, the expectations of being a Bennett. Everything I did was to preserve our position, our legacy. No, Richard, everything you did was to preserve the illusion of control, while systematically undermining the actual legacy Edmund built. I shook my head, suddenly weary of the circular conversation. The trust won't pay your gambling debts. Not now, not ever. If these creditors are as dangerous as you've implied to Diane, I suggest you speak with Jeffrey about legal protection options. Legal protection? He laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. These aren't people who respect restraining orders. Eliza, they're expecting payment by the end of next month, and they've made it clear that failure isn't an option. For a moment, genuine concern displaced my detachment. Despite everything, I didn't wish him harm. Then work with Jeffrey to establish a payment plan with your allowance. Sell assets if necessary, but the trust principal remains protected, as Edmund intended. Richard's expression hardened into something unfamiliar, a cold calculation that sent a chill through me despite the warm evening. There's another option. Melissa's trust for the baby. As father, I should have some input on those funds. That trust is irrevocable and specifically structured to prevent parental access, I replied firmly. It exists to protect your daughter. From exactly this type of situation. My daughter, he repeated, his tone shifting to something gentler, more manipulative. I've been thinking about her, about being involved in her life. I regret my initial reaction to the pregnancy. Perhaps there's a way forward that benefits everyone. Financial support for my immediate situation in exchange for a more active role as a father. The transparent attempt to commodify his relationship with his unborn child represented a new low, even for Richard. Fatherhood isn't a transaction, Richard. It's a commitment independent of financial considerations. If you genuinely want a relationship with your daughter, that path remains open regardless of your monetary situation. He stepped closer, desperation evident in his movements. You don't understand the seriousness of this situation. These people will take everything, not just from me, but from anyone connected to me. The firm, the family name, all of it could be compromised. Then perhaps it's time to face consequences directly, rather than manipulating others to shield you from them, I suggested quietly. I'll ask Jeffrey to help you explore legitimate options for addressing these debts. But I won't compromise Edmund's legacy or your daughter's future to solve problems created by your choices. For a moment, I glimpsed raw vulnerability beneath his carefully constructed persona. The frightened boy who had never quite lived up to his grandfather's expectations, who had sought external validation through increasingly risky behaviors. In that instant, I understood Richard more clearly than I had during 12 years of marriage. A man trapped in patterns established long before I met him, endlessly seeking but never finding the security and approval he craved. I could contest the trust, he threatened, the moment of vulnerability passing. Challenge Edmund's competency when he made you executor. You could, I acknowledged. But the legal proceedings would freeze all disbursements during litigation, including your monthly allowance. Is that really the outcome you're seeking? The logic penetrated his desperation. His shoulders slumped slightly as the futility of his position became clear. Then what am I supposed to do? Start over, I said simply. Accept the consequences of your actions, work with what you legitimately have, and build something authentic rather than maintaining illusions. As I spoke the words, I recognized they reflected my own journey over the past months. Accepting painful truths, working with available resources, and constructing a life based on genuine capabilities rather than external expectations. Richard stared at me for a long moment, something like recognition flickering in his eyes. You've changed. I've become more myself, I corrected gently. The woman you married was always there, just overshadowed by the role I thought I needed to play as Mrs. Bennet. In the fading light of day, standing on the property that had once represented our shared life, Richard and I reached the true end of our relationship, not through legal documentation or public announcement, but through the mutual recognition that the bonds between us had been severed not by betrayal alone, but by our divergent responses to that breaking point. I had chosen growth, painful but genuine. Richard continued seeking escape through the same patterns that had created his problems initially. Our paths, once entwined, now led in irreconcilably different directions. I'll have Jeffrey contact you tomorrow about options for addressing your financial situation, I said, moving toward the house. In the meantime, I suggest you speak with Diane. She's aware of your approaches to Eastern's acquisition targets. He paled slightly. Eliza, good night, Richard, I interrupted, no longer interested in his explanations or justifications. Make better choices. 6 months later, I stood in the hospital room where Melissa had just given birth to Eleanor. Grace Bennet, 7 pounds, 4 ounces of new life blinking solemnly at the world around her. Despite an invitation, Richard had not attended the birth. His attention focused on the structured repayment plan for his gambling debts that Jeffrey had negotiated with his creditors. The trust I controlled now funded not just Bennet & Sons, expanding sustainable investment portfolio, but also a separate foundation supporting women rebuilding their lives after relationship trauma. Diane Lockhart, surprisingly, had become a significant contributor to that foundation, our unlikely alliance evolving into mutual respect. As I held Eleanor Grace, her tiny fingers wrapping instinctively around mine, I reflected on the extraordinary chain of events triggered by Melissa's accidental appearance at my birthday celebration. What had initially felt like the most humiliating moment of my life had ultimately initiated the most profound transformation, freeing me from a marriage that diminished rather than enhanced my capabilities, connecting me with women who understood the specific challenges of Richard's manipulation, and positioning me to protect this innocent child from the chaotic patterns of her father's making. The night that had seemed like an ending had, in fact, been just the beginning, the first step on a path that led not to revenge or bitterness, but to something far more valuable: the discovery of my authentic self, independent of relationship to others, defined by choices rather than circumstances. As Eleanor's eyes drifted closed, secure in the knowledge that she was protected and cherished, I made a silent promise to ensure she grew up understanding her own worth, not as Richard Bennet's daughter or as a Bennet heir, but as herself, complete and sufficient exactly as she was. Some might call that the ultimate victory. I simply called it peace. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.